And I remember looking over at Pop-Tart and telling her that I felt like we should be manning a 4-H booth at the county fair. I felt totally deflated. And we did what two totally deflated people would do in that situation who are completely shy. We made a beeline for the piano room, and we sat down on the white couch, planted our feet on the white carpet, and we sat beside the white piano. We stared at the white panel walls in a room full of white people, and we didn't say a word. And then finally I looked up and I spied Carl Williams. He was the former All-Star quarterback from the year before. And I had contempt for him. He had a full beard since the 5th grade, and I was jealous of him. I hate guys like that, I said to Pop-Tart. And when I turned around, she said, "Here, drink this, and you'll really know if you hate him." And it's interesting because in my memory, I never remember Pop-Tart even getting up. I guess I was kind of obsessed in my own world there. But she had in her hands 2 crystal cups filled with green juice. And I took my cup and I said, "What's this?" And she said, "It's hawk juice." And I said, "What, hawk like a hawk that flies?" And she says, "No, silly, the Incredible Hulk, the guy that gets really green and big when he gets angry." And I took a sip and I said, "Oh my, it's spiked." And she said, "Yeah." She goes, "Are you a mean drunk or a stupid drunk?" And I downed the whole cup and I said, "I guess might be stupid." Well, by the time Judge Chapman called everyone into the room for my big piano recital debut, Pop-Tart and I had drunken nearly 2 trays of that hawk juice, which was nearly 28 cups. When he came into the room, I was looking through one of the crystal coffee cups, using it as a telescope, watching above as Judge Chapman kind of commanded the room. Judge Chapman was a huge man, nearly 400 pounds, which, just to give you an idea, that's like 17 Sarah Jessica Parkers, right? And he had this voice. He liked the sound of his own voice, and when he talked, his voice kind of had to orbit through this entire gastrointestinal galaxy as it moved up into his paranasal sinuses. And so when the words came out of his mouth, they sounded like a typical politician's. Totally important, but totally unintelligible. And finally, he introduced his daughter to a great applause, and by now, I was leaning over the sofa arm like a piece of bacon. She said a bunch of nostalgic stuff about high school, and then she turned around and kicked me in the leg, and she said, "You've got to get it together." And then suddenly, I was being led to the piano by Carl Williams. It's funny, he never even talked to me in school, and here he was. He had his hands on my body, and he was pushing me towards the piano. He sat me right down at the bench, and I looked at him, and I said, "I'm all wobbly." And he looked at me and said, "You got to concentrate on something, dude." And so that's when I turned around and I looked back into the room, into a sea of tuxedos and fluffy dresses and big hair. And coming down the stairs was a black swatch. And that black swatch was connected to Pop-Tart. She was in her sister's long black coat, and the front was open, and I could see that she was naked underneath. Oh, dear. I turned around at the piano and spread my fingers across the keyboard. And I realized as I began to push the keys that I was neither a mean drunk or a stupid drunk. I was a somewhat long-winded magician. Do you remember back in high school? Cold bleachers watching football. You thought the wind sprint was your downfall as you sought the noble cause. Do you remember back in high school? Friday games and the midnight dance. You were waiting for your first kiss. You were searching for romance. And as I kept playing, something interesting happened. The entire room moved forward. All the football players surrounded me like a huddle. There was Carl Williams standing on one side of the piano, and he was flanked by our former all-star safety on the other side of the piano. And sitting on the bench with me now was the famer all-star kicker. He had gone to Virginia Tech on full scholarship. And on the other side of me was the former all-star linebacker. And as I sang, they they all began to sing with me. Do you remember back in high school? Cold bleachers watching football. You thought the wind sprint was your downfall as you sought the noble cause. Something amazing happened as I continued to play and they continued to sing and they continued to surround me. I suddenly felt like I was one of the members of the team. In my haze, I felt like I was in the final game of my senior year. The coach had called my number. It was 4th and goal. We were behind by just a touchdown. He put his hands on my shoulders. I imagine this coach. Go in there and bring it home, kid, he said. I looked to my left, and I could see a tear falling down the former all-star linebacker's cheek, and they continued to sing. You remember back in high school, Friday games and the midnight dance. You were waiting for your first kiss. You were searching for romance. And then I finished the song like I did every song by hitting the 2 furthest keys on either side of the piano. And I let my hands fall into my lap, and a silence descended upon the room, only broken by a few sniffles and coughs of the guys who had started to cry and they were trying to hide it. And then the 2 players on either side of the bench, they jumped off. They lifted up the bench, and they started to march me around the room. It was like my bar mitzvah all over again. But instead of singing the Hava Nagila, they were singing the Skyhawk fight song. Hail to the Skyhawks, blue, white, and blue. Hail to the Skyhawks, for you we will be true. And then they set me down to a shower of shoulder slaps, and I wandered about the room, and then it really occurred to me in that moment that I had to, after consuming nearly 28 cups of the Hulk juice, I used the bathroom really bad. And my shyness prevented me at that time in my life from letting anyone know that I had to do anything human like use the bathroom. And so I wandered through the house listening in on conversations about things that I knew nothing about, like stock options and cruises in the summer. And finally I found the back door, and I wandered into the backyard, and beside this huge marble sculpture of an elephant, I relieved myself. What are you doing? I turned behind me. It was Pop-Tart. I'm peeing. What are you doing? I don't know. She said, I want to go home. Okay, let's go home. And then I zipped up, and she took my arm, and we walked through the house, and right at the front door, Judge Chapman stopped us, and he gave me the envelope with the money in it. He actually slipped it into my pocket, and then he said, and soon we were in my mom's GMC Pacer, riding along the driveway back home underneath the chestnut trees, and Pop-Tart informed me what had happened in the house. She had had a sort of dilemma. She had herself been looking for the bathroom and wandered up into the judge's reading room, and as she did, she felt a wave come over her, and before she knew it, this green horizontal waterfall emerged out of her mouth and splashed onto the judge's books and all on his desk. And so to remedy it, she had removed her sister's black dress and tried to sop it up, and she had finally given up and stuffed it into one of the judge's cigar tins. And that's why when I saw her with her sister's coat on and it flipped open and she was naked, I said, oh dear. Well, I took her to her father's house. I parked at the top of the driveway because sometimes the Pacer had a hard time getting up the driveway. It was this huge mountainous driveway. I backed in right at the top, and the January night settled in, and the coldness of the Virginia air settled in, and the Naugahyde seats began to settle underneath us. And I leaned against the window and looked up at the stars, and then Pop-Tart said, I really liked what you played tonight. And I nodded. And then she said, do you want to kiss me? And I nodded. And then she said, well, you better kiss me now before I change my mind. And I nodded, and suddenly I leaned into her, and my lips felt so good as they met hers. It felt like I was kissing cookie dough. and it felt so good that I leaned into her more, and then suddenly I was in the passenger seat with her. I was under her, and we were wiggling against each other, and that felt good. And then suddenly, as we kissed and we wiggled, and that felt even better, we began to lose our virginity to each other, and that felt amazing. And then I'm not sure if I saw a moth crash into the window while that was going on, or actually began to taste a moth, but there was a large sound like a muffler, and then Pop-Tart opened her mouth, and a green horizontal waterfall emerged out of her mouth into mine, and it began to drip down my suit, and it tasted sweet, and it tasted sour, and it tasted exactly like the Hulk juice. And as it came out of her mouth, it spun her in a circle, and when she spun in a circle, she reached for the passenger side door, and it opened, and she tumbled out. And I tried to grab her as she rolled down the hill, and all I did was I grabbed her coat, and as I held her coat, I fell out of the car, and we rolled down this long mountainous driveway, kind of like two Willy Wonka jawbreakers, rolling down and down and down until we finally came to a stop underneath her father's rhododendron bushes. And I laid up there and looked at the stars, and I thought maybe that I saw a shooting star, and then I heard Pop-Tart say, "We're like two peas in an alcohol-soaked pod." And then she stood up, and I remember thinking, wow, this is the first time I've seen a naked woman outside in a backyard with nothing on but high-heel shoes. And I picked up her coat, and I gave her coat, and she wobbled into her father's house, and then I walked back up to the pacer with my pants around my ankles, and I drove home. Well, she called the next day, and I didn't return her phone call. And she called the next week and left about 12 messages, and I didn't return any of her calls. I went back to college, and she called then as well, and I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say that I never talked to her again. I know for her I was this huge disappointment. She wanted a hero on a white horse to ride up and take her into a canopy bed and make love to her, and I just wasn't that person. But for me, it was more than that. For me, that night was a time of bittersweet firsts, my first time that really I had felt like I belonged to something. I felt in that moment that I belonged to that football team, that illusion of belonging to something. I had spent so much time with this firewall of shyness around me that when those guys picked me up on that stool and lifted me over their heads, wow, it cracked something in that wall and allowed some light to shine through. And it felt incredible. And it almost made me feel too vulnerable. And when I had lost my virginity in that pacer to Pop-Tart, there was another closeness there that I just couldn't reconcile. And in that moment, I remember thinking that even though that shyness had built a wall around me that made me feel safe, sometimes I just wanted to be back where it did feel safe and I didn't have to be close to other people. And it reminds me of what my mom said, which was, you have to, if you suffer in silence, it's a sin. And I guess for me, in passing this story along to you, I realize that I have to suffer no more and I have to sin no more. Thank you very much.
Coleman. Thunderous applause. Wow.